Did medieval women really spend their lives entirely unlettered, confined to domestic duties? Were books and scholarship solely for men during the period from the 5th to the 15th century? Prepare to uncover surprising truths about women's minds in the Middle Ages. Number 9, myth medieval women were universally illiterate and uneducated. This myth suggests that across all social classes and regions, women in the Middle Ages, from the 5th to the 15th century, lacked the fundamental skills of reading and writing and received no formal or informal instruction beyond basic domestic tasks. It paints a picture of an entirely unlettered female population, their minds untouched by books or scholarly pursuits. To challenge this widespread assumption, one can look at the lives of various women from different societal strata and historical periods. For instance, the renowned Abbess Hildegard of Bingen, living in the 12th century, was a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and polymath. Her works include theological treatises like Scivias, scientific texts on natural history and medicine, such as Physica in Causa et Curae, and over 300 letters. She corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings, offering advice and insights. Her intellectual output and the complexity of her writings clearly indicate a deep and extensive education, far beyond mere basic literacy. Hildegard's early schooling took place in a Benedictine monastery. Her writings show profound familiarity with Latin, theological concepts, and scientific observation. Her example alone suggests that at least some women in the medieval period achieved high levels of education and intellectual engagement. Beyond the exceptional religious figures, there is evidence of literacy among noblewomen. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a powerful 12th century queen, was known to be a vibrant patron of poets and scholars. Her courts, first in France and later in England, were centers of literary activity and cultural flourishing. Though direct evidence of her personal reading habits is sometimes debated, her role in fostering culture and her documented ability to manage complex political affairs, often involving written communication and diplomatic correspondence, indicates a level of intellectual sophistication that would be difficult to maintain without literacy. Her grandmother, Ermengarde of Anjou, was also known for her piety and intellectual interests, suggesting a tradition of educated women within noble families. The education of aristocratic girls often included reading, writing, and the study of religious texts, sometimes alongside practical skills like estate management. Many noblewomen managed vast estates and intricate households, which required reading and writing for accounts, legal documents, and extensive correspondence. This practical literacy was essential for their significant roles. The Paston Letters, a vast collection of correspondence from a prominent 15th century English gentry family, reveal numerous letters written by women within the family, such as Margaret Paston, who frequently handled complex family business, legal matters, and property management through written communication. Her letters demonstrate a functional and robust literacy crucial for her role in the family. Moving beyond the aristocracy and religious figures, glimpses of literacy appear in other social groups, particularly in urban centers. Among merchant families, women sometimes received an education to assist in family businesses. Wives and daughters of merchants might keep ledgers, write letters, and manage inventories. For example, the Dottini family papers from 14th century Italy provide an extraordinary window into the mercantile world. These papers contain numerous letters written by Margherita Dottini, the wife of the merchant Francesco Dottini. Her letters, though sometimes expressing challenges with grammar or spelling, demonstrate a clear ability to write and communicate effectively for both business and personal matters. This points to a functional literacy that was valued and acquired by women in the mercantile class. Similarly, in the northern European urban centers, records of women engaged in crafts like brewing, textile production, and small-scale trade often show them interacting with written documents for transactions, guild records, or legal proceedings. In England, wills and inventories from the late medieval period sometimes list books owned by women who were not noble or religious. While these lists do not definitively prove personal literacy for every owner, the ownership of books, especially devotional ones like psalters, books of hours, and prayer books, often implies an ability or at least an intention to read them. Studies by scholars like Carol M. Meal and Susan Grogue, they'll have highlighted numerous instances of middle-class women owning books in 15th century England. These books were not just for display, they were often devotional texts meant for private reading and prayer. The proliferation of books of hours, many lavishly illuminated, owned by women from various social strata, suggests a culture where personal engagement with written religious texts was common for women. And religious instruction also played a significant role in female literacy. Even for laywomen, the ability to read psalters, prayer books, and other devotional literature was encouraged by the church. Manuals of religious instruction were sometimes written in vernacular languages to make them accessible to a wider audience, including women. The Benedictine rule, which guided monastic life for both men and women, mandated daily reading as a core part of the monastic routine. This means that nuns, by the very nature of their vocation, were expected to be literate. Beyond the formal monastic settings, some parish churches provided basic instruction, and it is plausible that some girls attended these lessons alongside boys. The growth of lay piety movements in the later Middle Ages often saw women, such as beguines or tertiaries, reading and interpreting scripture and devotional texts for themselves and others. The existence of prominent female writers also challenges the notion of universal illiteracy. Marie de France, a 12th century poet, wrote a collection of lays, fables, and an Aesop adaptation, demonstrating sophisticated literary skill and a deep understanding of courtly literature. Christine de Pizan, a 14th to 15th century writer, is perhaps one of the most compelling examples. Widowed with children, she became a professional writer, producing numerous works including the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of Deeds of Arms and of Chivalry. Her extensive literary output, her engagement in intellectual debates, and her ability to support herself through her writing unequivocally point to a high level of literacy and scholarly accomplishment. Marjorie Kempe, a 15th century English mystic, dictated her autobiography, The Book of Marjorie Kempe, to scribes. While she herself may not have been able to write, her dictation meant an intellectual engagement with the written word, and her desire to have her experiences recorded and circulated indicates a cultural valuing of female experience in a literary context. The very act of dictation implies a comprehension of written communication and its enduring power. Furthermore, evidence of female scribes and illuminators, even if rare compared to their male counterparts, also points to women's direct engagement with book production and therefore literacy. Convents often housed scriptoria where nuns copied and illuminated manuscripts, preserving and disseminating knowledge. For example, the community of nuns at Santa Maria di Montevergine in southern Italy produced manuscripts in the 12th century, showcasing their direct involvement in the creation of books. Some laywomen were also involved in these trades, particularly in larger urban centers. Historical records, while fragmented, present numerous examples of women who either explicitly wrote, were recipients of written correspondence, or were associated with books and learning in ways that suggest a degree of literacy. The idea of universal female illiteracy overlooks these diverse examples and the varying educational needs and opportunities that existed across different regions and social strata throughout the long medieval period. It also ignores the subtle forms of literacy, such as the ability to read but not write, or vice versa, or literacy in one's vernacular language but not Latin, which were more common than full bilingual and bimodal literacy for both men and women. The assumption of universal illiteracy for women simplifies a much more complex historical reality, one where women were active participants in the intellectual and literary life of their times to varying degrees. Number 8. Myth-only aristocratic women received any form of schooling. This myth suggests that education was a privilege exclusively reserved for the highest echelons of medieval society, specifically for women of noble birth. It implies that women from the vast majority of the population, those in urban merchant classes, artisan families, and especially the peasantry, had no access to any structured learning or instruction. This viewpoint paints a picture of a sharply stratified educational landscape where birth determined access to knowledge. However, historical records reveal educational opportunities extended beyond the aristocracy, touching various social groups, even if in different forms and to different extents. While aristocratic women certainly had access to formal tutors within their households, or sometimes at convents, their education often encompassed not only reading and writing, but also courtly etiquette, music, needlework, and sometimes even basic Latin, history, and administration skills necessary for managing large estates. Examples like Matilda of Tuscany, a powerful 11th century ruler, received an education that allowed her to wield political power, engage in diplomatic correspondence, and patronize scholarship. She was fluent in several languages, including Latin, and possessed an impressive library, indicating a comprehensive and rigorous aristocratic education. Yet, formal and informal education existed for women in other social strata. In urban environments, a growing number of girls from merchant and artisan families received some form of schooling. These were often practical educations necessary for their roles in family businesses or trades. Daughters of merchants, for instance, learned arithmetic, how to keep accounts, and basic literacy to manage ledgers and correspond with clients. As discussed by historians like Martha Howell, the rise of commercial centers led to a demand for literacy among both men and women involved in trade. Women in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice involved in family businesses often possessed skills in reading, writing, and calculations crucial for daily operations. Margherita Dettini, mentioned earlier, is a prime example of a merchant's wife who managed significant business affairs through written correspondence, demonstrating literacy acquired through her urban, mercantile upbringing. Guilds, which organized crafts and trades in medieval towns, sometimes played a role in the education of girls. While male apprenticeships are more widely documented, some craftswomen inherited trades from their fathers or husbands, learning skills that sometimes included basic literacy for record keeping or understanding legal documents related to their craft. These women involved in textile production, brewing, or baking often needed to measure, calculate, and manage inventories, all of which could involve rudimentary numerical and textual literacy. In some instances, women were members of guilds themselves or ran family businesses independently, activities that often demanded functional literacy. For religious women, education was a fundamental requirement regardless of their initial social standing. Convents served as important centers of learning for women from diverse backgrounds, not solely the nobility. While many noble daughters were sent to convents for education, women from gentry, merchant, and even some peasant families also entered religious life. Once inside the convent, the rule of their order, such as the Benedictine rule, mandated daily reading. Nuns learned to read Latin for liturgical purposes and to engage with theological texts. Many convents had extensive libraries and operated their own scriptoria, where nuns copied and illuminated manuscripts. Abbesses like Heloise, a brilliant 12th century scholar and abbess, or Herod of Landsberg, the 12th century abbess who compiled the encyclopedic Hortus Deliciarum, demonstrate the high intellectual standards within some monastic communities for women. This was an institutionalized form of education, accessible, at least in part, beyond the very highest aristocracy. Even at the village level, where formal schooling was rare for anyone, some informal education occurred. Basic religious instruction, often delivered orally but sometimes involving the memorization of prayers that included reading elements, was available to all. Parish priests might teach basic catechism, which could involve some exposure to written words for those who showed aptitude. While peasant women largely remained illiterate in the formal sense, their lives involved forms of practical knowledge and communication, which sometimes included recognition of symbols, basic numeracy for market transactions, or understanding of land deeds, which are indirect forms of literacy. The ability to recognize one's mark on a document, or the ability to recite prayers from a devotional book one owned, indicates a spectrum of literacy that extends beyond simply reading and writing a letter. The spread of vernacular literature in the later Middle Ages also contributed to broader literacy among women. As more texts became available in local languages rather than exclusively Latin, they became accessible to a wider audience, including women who might not have learned Latin. These vernacular works included romances, histories, devotional texts, and even didactic works aimed at instructing women on various aspects of life. The existence of these texts implies an audience capable of reading them, many of whom were women from non-aristocratic backgrounds. The Book of Marjorie Kempe, dictated by a laywoman, was written in English, clearly intended for a broader vernacular readership. Christine de Pizan, though educated in Latin, chose to write many of her influential works in French, making them accessible to a wider female readership. Furthermore, women in some royal or noble households served as companions or ladies-in-waiting, often learning alongside the noble daughters, receiving a similar education regardless of their own lower social standing. This was an informal, but effective, way for non-aristocratic women to gain literacy and other skills. This patronage system extended educational benefits to a broader group of women than just the immediate family. The idea that only aristocratic women received education overlooks the diverse, albeit varied, forms of learning available to women across the medieval social spectrum. From the rigorous intellectual life of the convent to the practical arithmetic of the urban merchant's wife, and the basic religious instruction in villages, medieval women engaged with knowledge in ways that often defied simple class boundaries. The historical record suggests a more nuanced reality where educational opportunities, while not uniform, were not exclusively confined to the nobility. Number 7. Myth literacy for women was exclusively confined to convents and religious life. This myth proposes that the only place a medieval woman could gain literacy, or indeed any significant education, was within the walls of a convent. It suggests that outside of religious life, women in secular society, whether noble, urban, or rural, remained largely illiterate, with no opportunities or incentives to learn to read or write. This view narrowly defines female literacy as a monastic phenomenon. While convents undeniably served as crucial centers of female education and scholarship throughout the Middle Ages, offering rigorous schooling in Latin, theology, and the liberal arts, they were not the sole source of female literacy. For centuries, convents were indeed intellectual powerhouses, where women like Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim in the 10th century wrote Latin dramas, and Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century composed complex theological and scientific works. The monastic rule mandated daily reading, ensuring that nuns were literate. Many convents maintained impressive libraries and scriptoria, where nuns copied, illuminated, and even authored manuscripts. This tradition of monastic learning provided an unparalleled environment for female intellectual development. However, historical evidence demonstrates that secular women, those living outside of religious orders, also achieved varying degrees of literacy and engaged with written culture. Among the aristocracy, education was a significant part of a noblewoman's upbringing, often conducted within the family household by tutors, chaplains, or even other educated family members. Noble girls learned reading, writing, and sometimes Latin, essential for managing estates, understanding legal documents, engaging in correspondence, and for devotional practices. Eleanor of Aquitaine, as discussed, and her patronage of poets and troubadours indicates a sophisticated engagement with literature and culture that would be difficult to sustain without literacy. Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, possessed a significant personal library, and her involvement in political negotiations and courtly life suggests a high level of literacy. Accounts of royal and noble households reveal that books were present and that women were involved in reading them, often for entertainment as well as religious instruction. In burgeoning medieval towns and cities, women from merchant and artisan families often acquired functional literacy. This was not always formal schooling in the modern sense, but practical instruction within the family business. Wives and daughters kept household accounts, managed correspondence with suppliers and customers, and oversaw inventories. The Datini family letters from 14th century Italy, where Margherita Datini's correspondence details business dealings, exemplifies this urban, secular literacy. Such women learned to read and write in the vernacular to facilitate trade and manage complex domestic and commercial affairs. Records from various medieval guilds sometimes mention women as members or as inheritors of trades, and these roles often necessitated basic literacy for record keeping, legal transactions, or managing contracts. In London, there is evidence of women working as scribes and bookbinders in the 14th and 15th centuries, skills that inherently require strong literacy. The rise of vernacular literature in the later Middle Ages greatly expanded access to written materials for laywomen. Instead of only Latin texts, which primarily required formal classical education, books became available in local languages. This included devotional texts, popular romances, chronicles, and didactic literature. The ownership of books of hours, which were personal prayer books, became very common among aristocratic and wealthy urban laywomen in the later medieval period. These books were often lavishly illustrated and were clearly intended for personal use in reading. The existence of numerous such books, many with female owners' marks or inscriptions, strongly suggests widespread personal literacy among these groups. Female authors like Marie de France in the 12th century and Christine de Pizan in the 14th and 15th centuries provide powerful evidence of women's literary engagement outside of convents. Marie de France, a secular poet associated with the Anglo-Norman court, wrote in French, producing narratives and fables that were popular in courtly circles. Christine de Pizan was a professional writer who lived and worked in the secular world of Paris, supporting herself and her family through her literary output. Her extensive body of work, much of it in French, was aimed at a broad secular audience, including women. Her writings, such as The Book of the City of Ladies, were explicitly designed to educate and empower laywomen. These women were not nuns, their intellectual and literary lives unfolded entirely within secular society, demonstrating that high levels of literacy and scholarly production were possible for women outside of monastic institutions. Furthermore, evidence from legal documents like wills and property records reveals instances of women owning books. These women were not always nuns. They included widows, wives, and single women from various non-monastic backgrounds. The possession of books often implies an ability, or at least a desire to read them, or to have them read aloud, still engaging with the written word. This shows that books were present in secular households and that women were part of the reading public. The spread of basic religious instruction in parishes and through mendicant orders also reached laywomen. While perhaps not leading to advanced Latin scholarship, it encouraged recognition of basic prayers and texts. The very act of encouraging devotion through personal prayer books, whether in Latin or the vernacular, pushed women towards some level of literacy. Therefore, while convents offered structured and advanced educational opportunities for women, claiming they were the exclusive domain of female literacy overlooks the significant and diverse ways in which secular women, from queens to merchant wives, engaged with reading and writing in their daily lives and intellectual pursuits. The medieval period saw a gradual but definite expansion of literacy among women in secular society, driven by practical needs, personal devotion, and intellectual curiosity. Number 6, myth women were not active producers or patrons of books and knowledge. This myth contends that medieval women were passive recipients of culture, if they encountered it at all, and had no active role in the creation, dissemination, or financial support of books and intellectual endeavors. It suggests that the production of knowledge, whether through writing, copying, or funding, was solely a male domain, leaving women outside the intellectual currents of their time. Historical evidence strongly contradicts this narrow view, revealing numerous instances of medieval women actively producing texts, commissioning manuscripts, and fostering intellectual communities. From the early Middle Ages to the late period, women served as authors, scribes, illuminators, patrons, and collectors of books, playing significant roles in the transmission and expansion of knowledge. One of the most prominent examples of female authors is Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess. She was not just a prolific writer, but a groundbreaking one, producing theological works, scientific treatises, medical texts, and musical compositions. About her works, such as Scivias, Liber Vitae Meritorum, and Liber Divinorum Operum, are profound and original, demonstrating deep theological insight and a keen observational mind. Her letters reveal an active engagement with the intellectual and political figures of her day. Hildegard dictated her works to male secretaries, but she was the creative force behind them. Another powerful voice was Hrotsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine canoness. She composed Latin dramas, epic poems, and historical narratives, making her one of the earliest known female playwrights in the West. Her works, often adapted from classical forms but with Christian themes, were significant literary achievements, showcasing a command of Latin and classical rhetoric that was rare for her time, male or female. In the later Middle Ages, Christine de Pizan stands as a monumental figure. Writing in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, she was a professional author who earned her living through her pen. She wrote over 40 works, including poetry, political treatises, and works defending women, such as the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of the Three Virtues. She was deeply engaged in intellectual debates of her time, challenging misogynistic views and advocating for women's education. Christine oversaw the production of lavishly illustrated manuscripts of her own works, acting as a patron of scribes and illuminators. She meticulously curated her manuscripts, ensuring their quality and presentation. Beyond original authorship, women were vital as scribes and illuminators. Within convents, nuns frequently copied and decorated manuscripts. Scriptoria in convents like Celles in France in the 8th century or Quedlinburg in Germany were significant centers for book production. These nuns preserved classical and religious texts, ensuring their survival and dissemination. They copied liturgical books, theological works, and sometimes even secular literature. Their meticulous work was crucial for the transmission of knowledge. Some women in urban centers also worked as professional scribes or bookbinders, contributing to the commercial book trade. Examples from Paris and London indicate women involved in various stages of book production, from preparing parchment to ruling pages and adding decorations. As patrons, medieval women played an indispensable role in commissioning and acquiring books, thus supporting scribes, illuminators, and authors. Wealthy noblewomen and queens frequently ordered lavishly decorated manuscripts, often books of hours, psalters, or romances. For instance, Jeanne d'Ivry, Queen of France in the 14th century, commissioned the renowned Hours of Jeanne d'Ivry, a masterpiece of Gothic illumination. Blanche of Castile, regent of France in the 13th century, was a noted patron of learning and the arts, commissioning historical texts and moralized Bibles for her son, King Louis IX, indicating her intellectual guidance and support for the production of knowledge. Queen Philippa of Hainault, wife of Edward III of England, was also known for her patronage of chroniclers and literary works. The royal and aristocratic women also actively built personal libraries. Queen Eleanor of Provence, wife of Henry III of England, and her daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Castile, owned numerous books. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria accumulated an extensive collection of books, both religious and secular, which reveals her intellectual interests and financial support for book production. These libraries were not merely decorative. They were sources of reading and study. Women from the burgeoning urban middle classes also commissioned and owned books, particularly devotional texts and vernacular romances. Their wills and inventories from the late medieval period reveal an increasing number of women owning books. While these might not be as grand as royal commissions, they represent a significant contribution to the book trade and a widespread engagement with written culture. Furthermore, women were active in the intellectual life of their time in other ways. Abbesses like Heloise in the 12th century oversaw major monastic communities that functioned as centers of learning, attracting scholars and providing education. Beguines, independent religious women living in urban communities, were active in translating and copying devotional texts, making them accessible to broader lay audiences. Some women sponsored schools or religious foundations, which in turn supported the creation and study of books. The notion that women were passive regarding books and knowledge is dismantled by the sheer volume of evidence showing their active participation as authors, scribes, illuminators, and crucial patrons. Their contributions were fundamental to the literary and intellectual landscape of the medieval period, ensuring the preservation, dissemination, and creation of new knowledge. Number 5. Myth women's education was limited to practical household skills and domestic duties. This myth suggests that the sum total of medieval women's education comprised only skills necessary for running a household: cooking, cleaning, needlework, childcare, and basic estate management. It implies that intellectual pursuits, formal literacy, and broader academic subjects were entirely outside the scope of what women were taught or expected to learn, confining their intellectual lives strictly to the domestic sphere. While it is true that many medieval women, particularly those in rural and lower urban classes, acquired practical skills essential for daily life and the maintenance of their homes and families, this was by no means the sole extent of their education. The emphasis on domestic duties varied significantly across social classes, geographic regions, and historical periods, and intellectual training often accompanied or even superseded these practical skills, especially for women of higher status or those entering religious life. For aristocratic women, education went far beyond mere household management. While they certainly learned skills pertinent to overseeing a large noble household, including managing servants, budgeting, and organizing provisions, their education also encompassed courtly etiquette, music, dancing, and sometimes even hunting and hawking. More importantly, it often included rigorous instruction in literacy, writing, and arithmetic. Noble girls learned to read and write in their vernacular language, and frequently in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship. They studied religious texts, histories, and sometimes even classical literature. And education for a noblewoman might prepare her for managing vast estates in her husband's or father's absence, acting as a regent, or engaging in diplomatic correspondence. Eleanor of Aquitaine's education, for instance, allowed her to be a powerful political figure, a patron of arts, and a participant in complex courtly life. Her influence and capabilities extended far beyond basic domestic tasks. Matilda of Tuscany, an 11th century ruler, demonstrated a deep understanding of politics, law, and military strategy, skills cultivated through an extensive education far exceeding household competencies. Within convents, women's education was profoundly intellectual and academic. Nuns were taught to read and write Latin, which was essential for their liturgical duties and for reading religious texts. Beyond basic literacy, many convents provided a comprehensive education akin to that offered in monasteries for men. This included theology, philosophy, classical literature, music, and sometimes even science and medicine. The abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, exemplify this high level of monastic education. Her scientific and medical writings, Physica and Causae et Curae, reveal a detailed study of natural history, plants, and human physiology, a knowledge base far removed from simple domestic skills. Other abbesses like Herod of Landsberg, who compiled the Hortus Deliciarum, an encyclopedic work covering theology, philosophy, natural history, and classical literature, further demonstrate the breadth of academic pursuits available to women in monastic settings. In urban centers, particularly among merchant and artisan families, women's education often combined practical skills with functional literacy and numeracy. While they learned household duties, they also acquired skills necessary for family businesses. This included reading and writing for keeping accounts, managing inventories, handling correspondence, and understanding legal documents related to trade. Margherita de Tini's letters detailing her involvement in her husband's merchant business clearly show her engagement with practical literacy and numeracy for commercial purposes, extending beyond simple home management. Guild regulations sometimes reveal women's involvement in skilled trades, where they would learn the craft alongside potentially acquiring literacy for record keeping. The education received by women working in scriptoria as scribes or illuminators required advanced literacy and artistic skill, not just domestic proficiency. The rise of vernacular literature in the later Middle Ages also fostered a broader intellectual engagement among laywomen. Books of hours, romances, histories, and didactic texts became available in local languages. Women owned and read these books for personal devotion, entertainment, and instruction. Christine de Pizan, a professional writer, explicitly wrote to educate women on a wide range of subjects, from moral philosophy and political theory to practical wisdom for daily life, but always with an intellectual foundation. Her works, like the Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of Three Virtues, are testaments to women's capacity and desire for intellectual engagement beyond purely domestic concerns. Furthermore, medieval medical texts and herbals indicate that women, especially those acting as village healers or midwives, possessed and transmitted significant medical knowledge. This knowledge, often learned through apprenticeship and experience, encompassed botany, anatomy, and practical treatments, representing a specialized form of education outside the typical domestic sphere. While often oral, some of this knowledge was eventually codified in written texts, or women like Trotula of Salerno were associated with medical treatises. The idea that medieval women's education was strictly limited to domestic skills overlooks the diverse educational paths and intellectual pursuits undertaken by women across different social strata and throughout the medieval period. While practical skills were undoubtedly important, medieval women, particularly those of the nobility, in religious life or in urban commercial settings, pursued and attained far more comprehensive and intellectually rich forms of education, encompassing literacy, scholarship, and specialized knowledge in various fields. Number 4, myth women could not read or write in Latin, the language of scholarship. This myth asserts that medieval women were excluded from Latin literacy, thereby cutting them off from the vast majority of scholarly, theological, and legal texts of the period. Latin was the lingua franca of learning, the church, and formal governance. The myth implies that women, by lacking access to Latin, were effectively barred from participating in or even understanding the high intellectual culture of the Middle Ages. However, historical records present compelling evidence of numerous medieval women who were highly proficient in Latin, demonstrating not only the ability to read and write it, but also to compose complex and sophisticated texts in the language. While Latin literacy was indeed more widespread among men, particularly clerics, it was by no means exclusively a male domain. Within convents, Latin was a fundamental part of a nun's education and daily life. The liturgy, the Bible, patristic writings, and many theological texts were exclusively in Latin. Therefore, nuns were routinely taught to read and understand Latin from an early age. Many convents had extensive libraries filled with Latin manuscripts, and nuns were expected to engage with these texts. Some convents also housed scriptoria where nuns copied and illuminated Latin manuscripts, a task requiring precise Latin literacy. Outstanding examples of Latin literate women abound. Hratsvitha of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine canoness, wrote sophisticated Latin dramas, epic poems, and historical narratives. Her plays, modeled on Terence but with Christian themes, display a profound knowledge of classical Latin rhetoric and meter. Her ability to compose such works demonstrates an exceptional command of the language, far beyond mere reading comprehension. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, composed all her extensive theological, scientific, and musical works in Latin. Her dense and complex prose, rich in theological vocabulary and philosophical concepts, indicates a masterful grasp of the language. She corresponded in Latin with emperors, popes, and high-ranking clerics across Europe, engaging in complex intellectual and political discourse. Her writings were widely read and admired, further testament to her Latin erudition. Her Heloise, the 12th century scholar and abbess, was renowned for her intellectual prowess and her deep knowledge of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Her letters to Peter Abelard are celebrated for their sophisticated Latin prose and their philosophical depth. She later became abbess of the Paraclete, where she fostered an intellectual environment for her nuns, instructing them in Latin and classical texts. Her scholarly reputation in her own time was significant. Noblewomen also often received instruction in Latin, particularly if they were destined for influential roles or held deep religious devotion. For instance, Matilda of Tuscany, a powerful ruler in the 11th century, was educated in Latin and used it in her extensive diplomatic correspondence with emperors and popes. Her biographers noted her linguistic capability. Medieval wills and inventories of noble women frequently listed Latin books, such as psalters, books of hours, and biblical texts, suggesting an ability or at least an aspiration to read them. Even women who did not become professional scholars or religious leaders might have possessed varying degrees of Latin literacy for devotional purposes. Many books of hours, personal prayer books immensely popular in the later Middle Ages, contained Latin prayers and biblical excerpts. While some might have been used with guidance, the widespread ownership and use of these books suggests that a significant number of laywomen could read at least devotional Latin. This was a form of functional Latin literacy, sufficient for private prayer and religious understanding, even if not for scholarly composition. The development of vernacular languages for literary and administrative purposes in the later Middle Ages did not mean the complete abandonment of Latin. Rather, it meant that more options became available. Christine de Pizan, for instance, while writing many of her major works in French to reach a broader audience, was profoundly educated in Latin. Her father, a prominent scholar, ensured her access to classical texts and a deep understanding of Latin scholarship. She frequently referenced and debated classical Latin authors in her French works, demonstrating her grounding in Latin intellectual traditions. Furthermore, evidence of female scribes, both monastic and sometimes secular, who copied Latin texts implies a solid grasp of the language. These women were not just mechanically reproducing letters, they were often engaged in careful transcription, requiring an understanding of the text's meaning to ensure accuracy. Therefore, the claim that women could not read or write in Latin is disproven by numerous examples of highly Latin literate women who contributed significantly to medieval intellectual and literary life. While Latin literacy was certainly more common in certain contexts and social groups, it was an achievable and achieved skill for many medieval women, allowing them access to the vast intellectual resources contained within the language of scholarship. Number 3, myth: women didn't own books. This myth proposes that medieval women had no personal property rights over books and were therefore excluded from the private ownership and accumulation of written knowledge. It implies that books were solely owned by men, by institutions like monasteries, or were communal property, thereby limiting women's direct personal access to and engagement with written culture. However, historical records, particularly wills, household inventories, and monastic records, demonstrate that medieval women did indeed own books, sometimes in significant numbers, and that these books were often highly valued personal possessions. This ownership signifies women's direct engagement with written culture, either as readers themselves or as patrons who commissioned or inherited books for their own use or for the use of others. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence comes from the wills and inventories of noble women and wealthy urban women in the later Middle Ages. These documents frequently list books as personal property. For example, Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, wife of King Charles VI of France, possessed an extensive personal library in the early 15th century, with inventories listing numerous volumes, including both religious and secular texts. This collection shows not only her ownership, but also her intellectual interests and access to a wide range of knowledge. Other royal women, like Eleanor of Provence 13th century and Eleanor of Castile 13th century, queens of England, are documented as owning books, including French romances and religious texts. Beyond royalty, aristocratic women frequently owned books of hours, psalters, and other devotional texts. These personal prayer books were often lavishly illuminated and represented significant investments. Their widespread ownership by women, as documented in wills and inventories, suggests a common practice of female engagement with personal religious literacy. For example, the will of Elizabeth de Bohun, Countess of Northampton, in 1356, lists several books, including a Bible and a Psalter. The very existence of such entries means that women had the legal right to possess and bequeath books as part of their personal estate. In urban centers, particularly in the later Middle Ages, women from prosperous merchant and artisan families also owned books. As literacy became more widespread in these communities, so did book ownership. These books were often devotional, but sometimes included popular vernacular literature. Research by scholars like Carol M. Meal on medieval English women's book ownership reveals numerous examples of women outside the highest nobility possessing books. The value placed on these books is sometimes indicated by their detailed description in wills, where they are specifically bequeathed to daughters, friends, or religious institutions, signifying their importance as personal treasures or as symbols of piety and learning. Within convents, books were a fundamental part of monastic life. While the convent library was communal, individual nuns, and especially abbesses, often owned personal books. These could be brought with them upon entering the convent or acquired during their time there. For example, the Rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many women's communities, mandated daily reading. meaning that books were essential tools for spiritual and intellectual development within the convent walls. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen certainly had access to and likely owned personal copies of works for their own study and composition. The very production of manuscripts within convent scriptoria by nuns meant that books were an integral part of their lived experience and intellectual property within the monastic system. Some medieval books themselves bear evidence of female ownership. Inscriptions in manuscripts called ex libris, or similar notes, sometimes record the names of female owners. These might be a woman's name and her status, or a note about how she acquired the book. Such inscriptions offer direct proof of personal ownership. For example, the Bedford Hours, a magnificent 15th century manuscript, was created for Anne of Burgundy, Duchess of Bedford. While a royal commission, it became her personal prayer book, passed down as a prized possession. Furthermore, the act of commissioning a book, which many noblewomen did, implied a form of ownership and control over the content and appearance of the text. Christine de Pizan, for example, not only wrote her own books, but also supervised the production of lavishly illustrated copies of her works, effectively acting as a patron and ensuring her intellectual property was presented as she intended. This level of involvement demonstrates an active proprietary relationship with books and their creation. The widespread popularity of books of hours, tailored for individual use and often customized with personal prayers or images, is a strong indicator of individual female ownership. These were not generic texts, but personal devotional companions, often passed down through generations of women. The historical evidence shows that women from various social strata, from queens to urban women, were indeed owners of books. This ownership signifies their personal access to written knowledge, their engagement with literacy, and their active role in the consumption and transmission of medieval literary culture. The idea that women did not own books is clearly dispelled by the numerous examples found in the historical record. Number 2, myth women couldn't be teachers or scholars. This myth asserts that medieval women were excluded from roles as educators and scholarly authorities, suggesting that the transmission of knowledge and its intellectual advancement were exclusively male prerogatives. It implies that women were only students, if at all, never masters or producers of new learning, and that the academic world was entirely closed to them. However, historical accounts reveal numerous examples of medieval women who held significant roles as teachers, intellectual leaders, and recognized scholars, often wielding considerable authority within their own spheres. While they typically did not hold positions in the emerging universities, which were largely male institutions, women established and led alternative centers of learning and earned reputations for their intellectual acumen. Convents were primary sites where women functioned as teachers and scholars. Abbesses and experienced nuns were responsible for educating younger novices and the lay girls sent to the convent for schooling. This instruction encompassed Latin, scripture, theology, and often the liberal arts, including music, arithmetic, and sometimes even medicine or astronomy. Abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, in the 12th century, not only produced profound scholarly works, but also taught extensively through her writings and personal interactions. She led a thriving community where intellectual pursuits were paramount. Heloise, also in the 12th century, became an abbess of the Paraclete and transformed it into a renowned center of learning. She personally instructed her nuns, guiding them in the study of Latin, classical texts, and philosophy, demonstrating remarkable intellectual leadership and scholarly authority. Her own reputation as a scholar was recognized by leading intellectuals of her time. Beyond the formal role of abbess, individual nuns often distinguished themselves as scholars and teachers. Hrotsvita of Gandersheim in the 10th century was a learned canoness who authored original Latin dramas and histories, indicating her mastery of classical learning and her ability to transmit sophisticated literary forms. In the late 12th century, Herod of Landsberg, abbess of Hohenberg, compiled the Hortus Deliciarum, a vast illuminated encyclopedia covering a wide range of knowledge from theology and history to natural science and philosophy. This monumental work served as a teaching tool for her nuns, showcasing Herod's scholarly leadership and the educational mission of her abbey. In addition to monastic settings, some secular women also emerged as significant intellectual figures and educators. Christine de Pizan in the late 14th and early 15th centuries became one of Europe's first professional female authors. Her prolific writings were not merely entertainment, many were didactic, explicitly designed to educate women and men alike. Her Book of the City of Ladies and the Book of the Three Virtues, also known as the Treasure of the City of Ladies, directly functioned as educational texts, offering moral, social, and practical guidance based on extensive scholarship and historical examples. Christine actively engaged in intellectual debates of her time, proving herself a formidable scholar and teacher through her written arguments. She used her intellectual platform to advocate for women's education and to challenge misogynistic views. While less formally recognized as professors, women in many households, particularly noble ones, served as educators for their children and sometimes for other girls within their extended family or household. Mothers taught their daughters literacy, religious instruction, and skills in estate management. A literate and educated noblewoman was often responsible for ensuring her children received similar instruction, effectively acting as a primary teacher. In the realm of medicine, women, though largely excluded from universities, often practiced as healers, midwives, and sometimes as medical practitioners with a substantial body of inherited and learned knowledge. Figures like Trotula of Salerno, associated with a collection of important medical texts from the 11th and 12th centuries, represent a tradition of female medical knowledge that was taught, transmitted, and often put into practice. While the authorship of Trotula texts is debated, their association with a female figure underscores the historical presence of women as medical authorities and teachers in practical health care. Furthermore, women in some urban settings acted as scribes, bookbinders, and illuminators, passing on specialized skills and contributing directly to the production and dissemination of written knowledge. Their work involved high levels of literacy and artistic expertise, often learned through apprenticeship and then taught to others. The absence of women from university faculty roles due to the gendered nature of medieval universities should not be mistaken for a complete absence of female scholars and teachers. The medieval women found or created their own spaces, convents, courts, and their own studies to pursue intellectual inquiry, to author texts, and to educate others. They were active participants in the intellectual life of the Middle Ages, holding roles of authority as educators and earning reputations as scholars. Number 1, myth: all women's education was informal and at home. This myth proposes that any education medieval women received was exclusively informal, occurring solely within the domestic sphere of their homes, taught by parents, guardians, or older female relatives. It suggests a complete absence of structured, institutionalized, or public educational opportunities for medieval women, implying a limited and unsystematic learning environment. However, historical evidence reveals a much more varied and extensive landscape of female education than merely informal homeschooling. While domestic instruction was certainly a common and important pathway for many girls, especially in rural areas or for basic household skills, numerous medieval women received formal, institutionalized, or publicly organized education outside their homes. Convents stand as the most prominent example of formal education for women. Throughout the Middle Ages, convents served as dedicated educational institutions where girls and women received comprehensive schooling. Girls, often from aristocratic gentry and sometimes even merchant families, were sent to convents as oblates, children given to the monastery for education and eventual religious life, or as boarders for secular schooling. Here, they received instruction in Latin, the language of the church, and scholarship, as well as theology, music, and often the liberal arts. Nuns were taught to read and write, to copy manuscripts, and to engage with complex intellectual texts. Abbesses like Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, Rotsvitha of Gandersheim in the 10th century, and Heloise in the 12th century presided over highly intellectual monastic communities that were vibrant centers of learning far beyond any informal home instruction. These institutions provided a structured curriculum and access to extensive libraries, offering a level of education that few households could replicate. Beyond convents, certain urban centers developed various forms of schooling that sometimes included girls. In Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where mercantile activity created a demand for literacy and numeracy, some girls attended elementary schools or received instruction from private tutors. These schools, often called abacus schools or vernacular schools, taught reading, writing, and arithmetic in the local language, skills vital for participating in family businesses. Records from these cities indicate that girls, particularly from merchant families, received such instruction to assist with accounts, correspondence, and other commercial tasks. This was a formal, albeit practical, education often occurring outside the home. In some urban areas of Northern Europe, especially in the later Middle Ages, dem schools or small private schools run by women might have offered basic literacy instruction to both boys and girls. While less formalized than monastic schools, these were still organized educational settings outside the home. Furthermore, parish churches sometimes offered rudimentary instruction in catechism and basic literacy, which could have been accessible to girls as well as boys, even if attendance was sporadic and informal compared to dedicated schools. For aristocratic women, while much of their education might have occurred within the household, it was often far from informal. They were taught by hired tutors, chaplains, or governesses who followed a structured curriculum. This could include Latin, French, history, rhetoric, and music, in addition to managing large estates. This was a form of private, yet formal, instruction, distinct from casual learning from family members. Queens and noblewomen often had extensive libraries and learned from highly educated individuals, indicating a deliberate and sophisticated educational plan. Even the phenomenon of female authorship in the medieval period points to education beyond the informal home setting. Christine de Pizan, in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, received a superior education due to her father's position as a scholar at the French court. While her primary instruction came from her father and household, it was a rigorous academic education that allowed her to master Latin, classical texts, and to become a professional writer. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her time, but it illustrates a capacity for profound learning that transcended basic domestic instruction. Furthermore, the existence of female scribes, illuminators, and bookbinders in some urban centers, whether within a guild structure or through family apprenticeship, implies a formalized training process that led to highly specialized literacy and artistic skills. These trades required disciplined learning and practice, going beyond casual, informal instruction. While the home was certainly a place of learning for many medieval women, particularly for practical skills, it was by no means the sole or even always the primary locus of their education. Convents offered rigorous academic programs, urban schools provided functional literacy, and even private aristocratic households employed formal tutors. The historical record demonstrates that medieval women engaged with a variety of educational structures and opportunities, challenging the notion that their learning was exclusively informal and confined to the domestic sphere.